Did you feel miserable?
Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
If you look at exercise overall, so it's exercise is right up there. Nutrition, what we put inside our mouths, whether it's hydration, nutrition, or whatever that may be. Sleep, which is massive. And you talk about it, and it's been talked about before. I know you're a huge fan of Dr. Matthew Walker, and he's been on your podcast. It's one of the longest podcasts you've ever done. He's been on this show a few times. What I love about you talk about it differently. Everything in this book is talked about differently. It's more accessible. It's a bit more technical, but it doesn't feel so heavy as a read. But you do feel a bit cleverer having read it, which is important. And then right at the end of the book, when you least expect it, is this chapter on emotional health, emotional fitness, which I think lands so much more heavily because of the rest of the book before it. And I know that a lot of your mates who are also fans, I'm not your mate, but I am a fan. I'd love to be a mate one day. They said, oh, you should have put it at the beginning. I disagree, because I think it hits so much harder at the end, because I just wasn't expecting it. You were a fan of living longer for a long time. In many ways, if you make yourself your hobby, it's better for you and for everybody else around you. But as always, you can become over-obsessed with that. You became, by your own admission, over-obsessed about living longer. And this hit you like an express train. When and how?
Well, I mean, I think there were several things going on. And by the way, thank you for saying that. It still always remains a little bit sort of difficult to talk about that last chapter. And it almost didn't make it into the book. I mean, truthfully, the publisher sort of thought, it's interesting, but it doesn't belong in this book. Maybe you could write another book about that at some point. But I do agree that it probably belonged here, and I think that you're right. This is where it belonged. I think there were two things going on, and I think the biggest thing was, yes, on the one hand, I was hyper obsessed with, like I think most people, if they stop to think about it, not wanting to die. I think the problem in my case was the reason for that, I think, smacked of a desperation that was probably born of knowing that I wasn't living the best life. And so subconsciously, at a minimum, and maybe even sometimes consciously, there was a belief that said, look, you're really screwing up right now in your life. The longer you live, the more time you might have to fix this, even though you're not going to fix it now. So it was very much kicking the can down the road, putting my head in the sand. And I think I needed to confront all of that and realize that.
Yeah, you were sort of like doing what a lot of people do when they fall into the trap of just earning more and more and more and more money, because once they needed it, then they wanted it and still needed it a bit. Then they no longer need it. They don't want it, but they just can't break the habit of accruing more. And you were doing the same thing with time and health.
Right.
Same kind of issue, wasn't it, really? And then you went to various places that helped you out, and you're very candid about them in the book, and it's gripping reading. It really is, and very emotional. And you then fessed up, you think, hang on a minute, none of this matters if you're miserable. And so how have you changed your mindset then with regards to what you've learned whilst in the middle of writing the book? I was a fan of yours anyhow, before you experienced these things that you talk about, thinking you're the most sorted human on the planet, but it just wasn't the case.
Yeah, this book started in, I think, 2016, which of course was based on what I'd been thinking about for the previous, 5 or 6 years. And yeah, as you point out, I think the wheels are kind of coming off the bus in 2017, 2018, and even into 2020. And, I think that what you said is exactly right. And it was something that a woman by the name of Esther Perel, who's a therapist of mine, pointed an observation to me almost exactly 6 years ago. I remember it was actually July of 2017. And she said, it really... She said something effective. Doesn't it seem ironic that you have such an obsession with helping people live longer, yourself included, yet you seem to show no interest whatsoever in being less miserable? And although I didn't make any change at that moment, it always stuck with me. And of course, it became a very important part of this transition.
Did you feel miserable?
Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
You talk about being abroad, away overseas. in the past when certain things at home are happening that are important, and there was some cognitive dissonance there as well. Was that all was they all symptoms of the same thing, do you think?
Yes, absolutely.
What was that like?
Well, the story I write about is a, I think arguably one of the most shameful experiences of my life. At the time, I lived in California. So that's where my family was. And this was 5 weeks after the birth of my youngest son. I was in New York, which is where I worked. So I was commuting between California and New York. And when he was 5 weeks old, he had a very sudden cardiac arrest. Now, fortunately, it was witnessed by our nanny, who immediately brought this blue, lifeless baby to my wife, who is a nurse practitioner. So she was immediately able to do CPR on him. And within a few minutes, as the paramedics are arriving, she's bringing him back to life. There's, his eyes come back and his, everything. So they would go on to spend, a week in the hospital. But the unbelievable aspect of this is that I didn't come home. And I was just completely emotionally detached, busy, self-absorbed. I mean, even sort of trying to tell that story today, it's impossible to believe that I wouldn't have just immediately, at her request, of course, just hopped on that plane and gone home that evening. And she begged me and pleaded with me to come, but I wouldn't do it. And, again, I think that's just, that's the lowest example of, what a husband or a father would do. And of course, I justified it to myself by saying, yes, but you're here to take care of your patients. You're being a good doctor. But the truth of it is that none of that's true. I mean, it was just feeding my ego and not wanting to be emotionally involved.
Yeah, it's the emotion thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the deep emotion. It's the not being able to love yourself as a child, therefore not being able to love your own children because you don't really know that love, or you've shut that love down. And you talk about that in the book as well, don't you? Oh my goodness, Peter! So much.